The rain in Seattle doesn't just fall, it haunts. It clings to the glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows of a penthouse that, technically, Jack and Sarah Miller no longer owned. In 48 hours, the bank would take the keys. The Italian leather sofas were gone, sold to pay a lawyer who couldn't ultimately save them. All that remained in the center of the echoing living room was a scratched mahogany coffee table and a single crumpled $10 bill. The rain in Seattle doesn't just fall, it haunts. It clings to the glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows of a penthouse that, technically, Jack and Sarah Miller no longer owned. In 48 hours, the bank would take the keys. The Italian leather sofas were gone, sold to pay a lawyer who couldn't ultimately save them. All that remained in the center of the echoing living room was a scratched mahogany coffee table and a single crumpled $10 bill. Their empire hadn't just collapsed. It had vaporized in a cloud of over-leveraged scaling. They had fallen into the classic trap of borrowing against future projections, spending money they hadn't yet earned to buy growth they couldn't sustain. When the market shifted, their foundation turned to sand. Sarah's eyes were red-rimmed but dry, her face a mask of exhausted determination. She looked at the bill, then at Jack, her mind already calculating. "We have $10, Jack," Sarah said, her voice a brittle whisper that seemed to bounce off the empty walls. "Not 10 million, not 10,000. 10. That's our total liquid net worth." Jack didn't look up. The silence was heavy with the ghost of their former success. He felt the weight of every failure pressing down on his shoulders. The man who once commanded boardrooms was now intimidated by a small piece of paper sitting on a cheap table. "We have two choices," she continued, her tone shifting into that clinical, operational gear that had once made her the most feared executive in her sector. "We can use this to buy 2 coffees and a muffin, sit on the curb, and wait for the end to swallow us. Or we make an agreement." Jack finally looked at her, seeing a spark of the old Sarah, the one who could optimize a global supply chain in her sleep. He felt a flicker of hope for the first time in months. "What kind of agreement?" Jack asked. Sarah leaned forward into the dim light. "The $10 agreement," she said. "We treat this $10 as our seed capital. We treat our lives as a startup with a burn rate of 0, because we have nothing left to burn. We rebuild from the ground up, but we do it with one ironclad rule. Every cent is tracked, every decision is mutual, and we never, ever grow faster than our logic can support. We start over for real. To understand how they climbed out, one must understand the depth of the hole they were in. In technical terms, the Millers were victims of their own ambition. Their previous company grew 300% in a year, but their margins were negative. They were burning cash to buy customers, a strategy that works until the venture capital dries up. They had been living on phantom wealth, money that existed on spreadsheets, but never in their own bank accounts. "Our first mistake," Jack admitted later, "was confusing valuation with value. Valuation is merely what someone else thinks you're worth on a good day. Value is what you actually provide to the market every single day." That final night in the empty penthouse, they didn't pack suitcases. They performed a post-mortem on their own lives. They sat on the floor and identified their technical debt, the broken habits and ego-driven decisions of their past. They decided to apply the lean startup methodology to their marriage and their future. They weren't Jack and Sarah, the power couple, anymore. They were a 2-person team with an MVP, minimum viable product, their own 2 hands, and a $10 bill. They realized that their previous failure wasn't just financial. It was systemic. To succeed, they needed a new operating system for their lives, one based on radical transparency and 0 waste. The next morning, the rain had turned to a gray mist. They walked out of the penthouse for the last time, carrying only backpacks. They didn't have a car. It had been repossessed weeks ago. They headed toward a local thrift store in a less affluent part of town, their feet aching as they covered the miles. Every step was a reminder of how far they had fallen, but also of the clean slate they were now working with. The mission had begun. In business, arbitrage is the simultaneous purchase and sale of an asset to profit from a difference in the price. Jack, ever the intellectual, wanted to find a rare book at the thrift store and try to flip it online. He saw a dusty copy of an old textbook and reached for it, thinking of the potential profit margin. But Sarah shook her head, stopping his hand before he could spend their only asset. She was thinking about something much faster. No, Jack, think about the velocity of money, Sarah argued. Books take too long to list, ship, and wait for the buyer to pay. We need a high-frequency turn. We need to turn this $10 into $30 before the sun goes down, or we don't eat tonight. We can't afford to have our capital tied up in inventory that doesn't move. She scanned the shelves with the shills, precision of a hawk, looking for something that could generate immediate cash flow. Her eyes landed on a heavy-duty, used cleaning kit tucked in a corner, a plastic bucket, a half-full bottle of industrial glass spray, and a pack of microfiber cloths. The price tag read $8.95. After tax, it came to exactly $9.45. They walked out of the store with $0.55 in their pockets and a bucket in Jack's hand. They weren't looking for a career anymore. They were looking for a margin. They headed toward the nearest office complex. The windows of the complex were streaked with salt from the Puget Sound breeze. Jack, the former CEO, who used to wait for assistants to bring him water, didn't ask for a manager. He walked straight into a small corner deli. "I'll clean your front windows and your display cases right now for $20, Jack told the owner. "You don't pay a cent unless they're perfectly clear." The owner looked at their expensive athletic gear and shrugged. For the next hour, Jack and Sarah worked in a silent, synchronized rhythm. They weren't just cleaning. They were applying a process. Jack handled the scrubbing, while Sarah followed with the microfiber cloths, ensuring there wasn't a single streak. By the time they finished, the display cases gleamed under the deli lights, making the pastries look twice as appetizing. The owner was impressed and handed them a crisp $20 bill. By the end of the day, they had hit 4 more shops in the same block. They ended their first day of the new empire with $110 in cash. The technical lesson here was profound. They had moved from asset-heavy operations to service-based scaling. In the early stages of recovery, your only infinite resource is your own labor. By removing ego from the equation, they eliminated the emotional overhead that stops most people from starting over. By the end of the first week, that $110 had grown to $1,200. They were staying in a cheap, flickering sign motel and eating nothing but instant oatmeal. Their muscles ached in ways they hadn't felt since college, but the agreement was working. Every night, they sat at a small plastic table and accounted for every penny. However, a rift began to form. Jack, seeing the $1,200, felt his old disruptor instincts kicking in. He wanted to gamble. Jack wanted to take that money and bet it on a new software ID, a small app that could automate window cleaning schedules. He was ready to pivot back to the world of code. But Sarah placed her hand over the cash. "If we do that, we're back to speculating," she said firmly. "We need to buy a used industrial power washer. We need to stay in the world of physical results until our foundation is solid. No more shortcuts, Jack." This was the first true test of the $10 agreement. It wasn't just about money. It was about the philosophy of growth. "If we buy the power washer," Sarah explained, "our unit economics improve instantly. Right now, we are selling manual labor. It's a 1-to-1 ratio. If we have a power washer, we can clean a driveway in 20 minutes that currently takes us 2 hours. We aren't just working harder. We are increasing our throughput." Jack saw the logic. He realized he was trying to skip levels, a common mistake for entrepreneurs who have previously tasted success. They bought the power washer the next morning. With the new equipment, they began to implement standard operating procedures, SOPs. Sarah created a rigorous checklist: pre-treat oil stains, pressure spray from top to bottom, and apply a post-treatment sealant. This upsell was the key to their rapid growth. They weren't just washing away dirt. They were offering property protection. This shift in marketing moved them from a commodity service to a value-add service. While their bank account grew, their relationship was the real product in development. In their previous life, they had communicated through assistants and calendars. Now, they were forced into radical proximity, solving problems in real time in a cramped motel room. They began to practice radical candor. When Jack felt the urge to spend $50 on a nice dinner to celebrate, Sarah didn't just say no. She showed him the data. She checked the customer acquisition cost, CAC, of their next week's flyer distribution. Is this steak dinner worth 4 new potential clients? She asked. It wasn't. They ate the oatmeal. They were learning the difference between standard of living and quality of life. Their standard of living was low, but their quality of life, measured by their total alignment and shared mission, was the highest it had ever been. 3 months in, they had $15,000 in the bank. In the world of business, this is the valley of death. It's a dangerous middle ground where you have enough money to feel tempted to relax, but not nearly enough to be safe from bad luck. Jack realized they were hitting a scaling ceiling. There were only so many driveways they could wash in a day. To move to the next level, they needed leverage. Jack remembered a lesson from his tech days. Leverage comes in 4 forms: labor, capital, code, and content. They didn't want to manage a fleet of workers, labor, and they didn't have enough to play the markets, capital. So they looked at the 2 most powerful forms of leverage in the modern age: content and code. Jack began documenting their system. He wrote about the SOPs, the unit economics of a power washing rig, and the psychological framework of the $10 agreement. He started a simple blog, not to show off, but to provide a how-to for other people in financial trouble. Sarah managed the back end, ensuring that when people searched for starting a service business, Jack's articles appeared. They were becoming consultants for the everyman. They were applying the compound effect. In finance, compound interest is applied to money, but the Millers applied it to their reputation. Every job they did was performed with extreme ownership. They asked for reviews and followed up with customers a month later. Their customer lifetime value, CLV, skyrocketed. People didn't just want their driveways cleaned. They wanted to talk to the professional couple who worked with such intensity. Neighbors began referring neighbors. Soon, they didn't even need to hand out flyers. One night, while looking at their growing digital followers, Sarah turned to Jack. We're not selling a service anymore, Jack. We're selling a framework. They decided to package their SOPs into a comprehensive digital course. The cost to produce a digital copy, once the first one was finished? 0. The marginal cost of replication was null. This is the moment where real empires are truly built. By the end of year 1, the $10 they had clutched in that empty penthouse had transformed into $250,000. But the Millers didn't rush back into luxury. They stayed in a modest 2-bedroom apartment, continuing to track every dollar. They were now operating on the Rule of 40, a principle where a company's combined growth rate and profit margin should exceed 40%. Because they had no debt, and their digital products had almost no overhead, their growth was explosive. Their margins were nearly 90%. Predictably, the old world came knocking. They were approached by a prestigious venture capital firm, the same kind of people who had watched Jack's first company burn. We'll give you $5 million for 30% of the business, the VC partner said. You can take this global overnight. In their old life, Jack would have signed the contract before the ink was dry. He would have been seduced by the prestige. But this time, Sarah and Jack didn't even need to whisper. They were perfectly aligned. They didn't need the capital. They had achieved what few businesses ever do: negative working capital. Their customers paid them up front for their courses, meaning the business was literally funding its own growth. "No," Jack said, his voice calm. "We're keeping the equity. We're building this on cash flow, not speculation." The VC was stunned. "But you could be 10 times bigger in half the time." He argued. "Speed is a liability if the foundation hasn't cured," Sarah countered. "We're not building a rocket ship designed to crash. We're building a mountain that stays." They walked out of the office, owners of their own destiny. 2 years after that rainy night in Seattle, Jack and Sarah finally bought a new home. It wasn't a glass penthouse. It was a sturdy farmhouse in the valley with a view of the mountains. In the entrance hallway, there hung a small, simple wooden frame. Inside it sat a crumpled, slightly dirty $10 bill, the same one from the mahogany table. They had rebuilt their empire, but the 2.0 version was built on 3 unbreakable pillars. First was frictionless communication. They solved problems when they were $10 problems before they became $1,000,000 disasters. Second was operational excellence. They prioritized systems over hustle, knowing that a good system could run without them. Third was the $10 filter. Even with millions, they still discussed non-essential expenses with the same gravity they used when they were choosing between a meal and a tool. The empire wasn't the money in the bank. The money was just the scoreboard. The real empire was the process they had created. Jack stood in the kitchen one morning, pouring coffee for Sarah. He wasn't the disruptor CEO anymore. He was a builder. "The hardest part wasn't making the money back," he said, glancing at the framed bill. "It was the psychological shift of believing that $10 was actually enough to start." Sarah smiled, taking the mug. "It wasn't the $10 that saved us, Jack. It was the agreement. The money was just a tool. The agreement was the foundation." The farmhouse was quiet, save for the crackle of the fireplace. Jack adjusted his tie, preparing for a keynote speech at a global entrepreneurship summit. He looked at the crumpled paper, a silent witness to their sweat, their arguments, and their ultimate triumph. As Jack reached out to straighten the frame, his sleeve caught the edge. The frame wobbled, slipped from the wall, and shattered against the hardwood floor. "Damn it," Jack whispered, kneeling to pick up the shards. He reached for the bill, which had fluttered out of the broken glass. As he turned it over to check for damage, he froze. On the back of the bill, in the corner, there was a small faded mark made with a blue ballpoint pen. It was a date, October 12th, 2014, and next to it, a tiny hand-drawn heart. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. October 12th, 2014, was the day he and Sarah had their very first date at a dive bar in Brooklyn. They were broke college graduates then, and he had used a $10 bill to pay for 2 cheap beers. Sarah had laughed, grabbed the change, and scribbled that date on the bill. "Let's keep this," she had said back then. "It's the best investment we'll ever make," she had told him a decade ago. Jack sat back on his heels, the realization hitting him hard. That night in the penthouse, when they were at their absolute lowest, when they thought they were down to their last cent, that $10 bill hadn't just appeared by chance. Sarah hadn't found it in the cushions of a sofa. She had been carrying it in a hidden compartment of her wallet for over 10 years. She had kept it through the heights of their wealth and the depths of their bankruptcy. In that moment of total collapse, Sarah hadn't offered him financial capital. She had offered him a sunk cost that actually mattered. In central banking, there is a concept called the reserve requirement. It is the minimum liquid assets a bank must hold to ensure the system does not collapse during a panic. Sarah had been their central bank. While Jack was focused on external valuation, Sarah was managing their intrinsic value. She knew the $10 bill wasn't enough to buy a business, but it was enough to buy belief. She had injected liquidity into their dying marriage by using a token of their beginning to fund their second chance. The empire wasn't rebuilt on a piece of paper. It was rebuilt on the asset of a shared history that she refused to let go of. "Jack, the car is here," Sarah called out, walking into the hallway. She saw the broken glass and the bill in his hand. She stopped, her eyes meeting his. She didn't look guilty. She looked peaceful. Jack held up the bill, showing her the blue ink heart. "You had this the whole time," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We weren't actually down to our last $10. We always had this reserve." Sarah walked over and placed her hand on his chest. "We were spiritually bankrupt, Jack. If I had told you I had a secret savings account, you would have used it to pay a debt, and we would have stayed the same people who failed. I didn't give you money. I gave you a seed round of hope. I needed you to believe that $10 was all we had, so you'd remember that we were all we needed to survive and thrive." Jack looked at the bill, then at the woman who had strategically orchestrated their resurrection. He realized that the greatest empire they owned wasn't the company, the farmhouse, or the bank account. It was the equity they held in each other's souls, an asset that, unlike the market, can never be devalued or stolen. He realized that Sarah's long-term play was the most successful investment he had ever seen in his career. He tucked the $10 bill into his breast pocket, right over his heart. "Let's go," he said, smiling. "I have a speech to give, and I think I just found a better opening line." They walked out to the car, leaving the broken glass behind. They were heading to a stage where thousands of people were waiting to hear about the $10 agreement. But Jack knew the real story was about the hidden heart on the back of the bill. At the summit, Jack stood before the crowd. He didn't talk about ROI or market share first. He held up the crumpled bill. "Most people think a business starts with capital," he told the silent room. "But capital is just fuel. If the engine is broken, fuel just causes a bigger fire. You start with an agreement. You start with the person standing next to you. You start by valuing what cannot be bought or sold." He explained the technical concepts of cash velocity and operating margins, but he framed them through the lens of human resilience. He told them about the power washer and the motel room. He watched as seasoned investors and young founders alike leaned in, captivated not by the millions they had made, but by the $10 they had shared. He was no longer a fintech disruptor. He was a human being again. As he finished his speech, he looked into the front row and saw Sarah. She wasn't checking her phone or looking at a spreadsheet. She was just looking at him, a small smile on her face. The empire was in full bloom, but it was the quietest it had ever been. There were no flashing lights or screaming headlines, just the steady, rhythmic beat of a business built on truth and a marriage built on a $10 reserve. Jack stepped off the stage to a standing ovation, but he barely heard the applause. He walked straight to Sarah and took her hand. "Great speech," she whispered. "Thanks," he replied, feeling the crumpled bill in his pocket. It was an expensive opening line, but worth every cent. They walked out together, two people who had turned $10 into an empire, and a decade of love into a future that was finally, truly, their own.